All right, welcome everybody. We're super excited on this lovely sunny Friday afternoon to take you through a super quick summary of our analysis on the topic of integrity in personal care. This is a highly requested topic, so we decided to do a small group for this. Of course, as usual, I know this is a short session, but as usual, please post your comments or your questions in the thread. My business partner, Jason's on the line. He will field them at the end of the session. The goal is to try and run through this presentation in a quick 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll take a couple of minutes to run through some questions, and we'll give everybody much needed time back. I know we're all tired and exhausted with Zoom calls, but hopefully this session is going to energize you because this is a hot topic. As you can imagine, there is no lack of new claims in the personal care space. A key question is emerging now, in particular on how consumers evaluate what is considered real, what is believable, what is truthful in the world of personal care. So we're really studying the meanings around integrity in the context of personal care here. First of all, just to build empathy for the mindset of the consumer, obviously this is about ethical living. This is about moral judgment for the decisions we make as human beings. And people genuinely want to make decisions where they don't get called out by others around them. And that's really what the driving force is here. The other interesting thing to also note is overall the macroculture of integrity in personal care is in early consensus. It's not mainstream yet, and that's also a good thing for us to be studying this culture. But it is also overall, the macroculture is also exhibiting a little bit of volatility. Now, what that really means is that there's something within it that is offering growth potential, but the overall culture is still trying to figure itself out. And so this is one of those classic cases where finding the right microcultures within this macroculture is going to be critical, because the right microculture will really give us the pathway to accelerate growth and to really benefit in this marketplace. So there are 4 microcultures that we uncovered here through our process. Our PhD concierge, as usual, spent a week, so 5 business days, studying this topic using our technology motive-based trends. We uncovered 4 microcultures. The first microculture is on ingredients. We'll dive into each, by the way, and just do quick summaries of them. And then everybody will get access to the report to spend your time on it. The second microculture is on the notion of ethics. The third is on this idea of evidence and expertise, and the fourth on representation. So let's go through each one of them, all very interesting. The first on understanding ingredients. As you can imagine, the key takeaway here is if the ingredient is better for the environment, it is also better for my body. The two go hand in hand. You cannot decouple them anymore. Now, in this context, the consumer is deeply concerned about greenwashing. That is what is creating the skepticism. That is what is making them afraid of products that aren't marketed with integrity, so to speak, right? And in particular, what this is doing is it's driving a deep interest for single ingredient and small ingredient product lines. Guess why? If I just see 1 or 2 ingredients on the label, I actually am more likely to believe as a consumer that they're being truthful about what is actually in this product. That's the interesting thing about it. It gives the consumer reassurance that the ingredient list is comprehensive. How interesting is that? There's a lot more, by the way, that we'll let you explore at your own time. But this is a microculture that's relevant to 37.5 million consumers today. It's growing by 20% in the short term, and it is just in early consensus, but making its way into mainstream acceptance. It is the poster child for innovation. Lots of opportunity. The second microculture is on this notion of ethics. Of course, animal welfare, of course, environmental welfare and environmentally conscious decision-making comes into play here. But in particular, why ethics? Because people want real certifications. They want certifications from bodies that they consider to be legitimate, maybe nonprofit bodies, maybe bodies that are well known and established the world over. That's how they gain legitimacy. That's how they are vetting whether the product is in fact ethical. Now, here's the other thing too that's very, very interesting. Consumers are relying on vetting done by trusted influencers. For example, Catherine Kellogg, a sustainability expert, or an independent agency like the Coalition for Consumer Information and Cosmetics, the CCIC. Trusted influencers, vetting by trusted influencers goes a long way here. In addition to that, of course, there are a whole host of other cases, similar organizations that people are relying on in order to give legitimacy to claims around ethics, whether it's the ASPCA or obtaining certification from the Leaping Bunny program, all things necessary in order to certify that a product is not just environmentally conscious in terms of how it's made, but also in terms of how it's packaged and distributed and all of that. And then lastly, I will say that ethics also links to the supply chain. This is very important because all of us are so used to talking about, packaging and the product itself. It's important to note that it is being linked by the consumer to the supply chain. So it's not just about what is being supplied to create the product, but also, by the way, about how it's being disposed. Very, very cool. Now, this culture is relevant to about 35 million, but look at the growth on this. 54% growth. However, it is still pre-mainstream. So any opportunities here, we must bear in mind that they're not going to yield in the short term. They're not going to yield immediately, but they will yield in the midterm. So whatever investments we make in here, we got to pay attention to the fact that it might be more than a 2-year trajectory, but the growth is so massive that is unignorable. The third is on evidence and expertise. There is some connection here to what we talked about around ethics, but in particular, what we find is that consumers are actually becoming wary of science buzzwords. That's interesting. Microsmoothing, biomolecular. Consumers consider these jargon, unrecognizable terminology that they see on packaging and advertisements that is actually deterring them. It is actually creating a lack of legitimacy. It's taking away from the feeling of integrity. And this is again where consumers are looking for accredited third-party influencers and websites like Lab Muffin Beauty Science to really explain the efficacy or the toxicity of a product. Now, relating to this, another interesting thing to really point out is that people of color, people with Afro-textured hair, so Black consumers, and people of color are really paying key attention in this microculture. Why? Because a lot of the evidence and the expertise doesn't really speak to them or their needs. So they're specifically looking at whether it's dermatologists or experts that are Black, experts that are Hispanic, experts that are people of color that understand, have an expertise, understand the needs of people of color, of women of color in particular, obviously here, really, really important. So the whole component of get rid of jargon and buzzwords. Let's talk about what is real here and let's vet this through scientific analysis, but we need to bring in experts that are not just sort of traditional, white coat experts. We need to bring in experts that also understand the needs of those who are not, sort of the majority population. Now, the one thing to note is this microculture, unfortunately, is not growing. It is exhibiting some volatility. It is smaller compared to the other microcultures. And that tells us that the meanings around this microculture is still not fully formed. So as this develops, we will have to revisit this in a little bit of time. But it's important to note that there's still some confusion about how exactly do we truly judge the evidence being presented to us, and how do we truly judge whether the expertise that's being shown to us is worthwhile and trustworthy. And then the last one is on representation of products. This relates to the previous point we just made, but this is in particular about the lack of representation of Black and women of color, lack of representation of LGBTQ owned businesses in the personal care space. There's a lot of discussion here, especially among Black Americans, about how hair care in particular is very limited for them. There's a lot of discussion of examples like, Deva Curl, brand that sparked a lot of outrage because in fact, their hair care brand for Afro textured hair was actually causing severe long-term hair loss. So there's this perception that, people of color are sort of, either underrepresented or not represented enough in terms of new innovation, new technology, new development. And as a result, the solutions available for people of color are actually sort of the lower rung solutions that are not top of the line or not the most innovative. So there's a big gap here that needs to be addressed perceptually to bring greater integrity to the personal care space. And of course, there's a lot of conversation, of course, about lack of inclusion, lack of diversity in advertising and marketing, how traditionally advertising marketing is focused on white, thin, hetero cisgender standards of beauty. So there's a lot of work to be done. But again, really interesting microculture that is growing and in fact has attained mainstream acceptance. I don't think that should not come as a surprise to you, especially given the events of 2020, but certainly has attained mainstream acceptance. The one thing to note, unlike the other microcultures, unlike the first two microcultures, this one's growing slowly. It's not growing over 12 months, it's growing over 5+ years. Where does that leave us net? It leaves us with 4 microcultures where 2 of them are ripe for innovation. The whole idea of ethical footprints. So we talked about ethics and about certified accreditations. And then we talked about representation in products and solutions for people of color. Those are the 2 that have mainstream acceptance. They're growing. We also talked about understanding ingredients, which is growing a lot, but it's currently just pre-mainstream. So it's just something to note. But it leaves us in a place where there are, in essence, out of the 4 microcultures, 3 are growing and offering incredible value and opportunity if we care about building integrity for our brands, our solutions, our product lines in the personal care space. And of course, as usual, when you review the report, you'll be able to click and interact with the report. You'll be able to see a 1-page executive summary here. And you'll also be able to see an appendix where there's a detail of the sociodemographics. The one thing I will bring up is some calls to action that we sometimes note here. Our team notes them. It's just as thought starters. And there are some interesting thought starters here, just to bring this all back to tangible tactical outcomes. For example, have you thought about using QR codes on product packaging that provides consumers detailed evidence about third-party vetting of the products and solutions you bring to market? Have you thought about biodegradable, compostable materials in your product packaging? I'm sure most of you are working on that. Have you thought about collaborating with trusted, accredited influencers, especially who are BIPOC, obviously people of color who represent LGBTQ audiences and so on? Have you thought about descriptions of ingredients on product packaging where the ingredient list itself is in large text? What a novel idea. It will completely change the perceptual framework of how consumers evaluate your products. Just some thought starters of how tangibly this translates into very actionable outcomes. Jason, should we spend a couple of minutes taking a couple of quick questions and then we'll give people some time back?
Yep, that's perfect. I do have a couple of things that came up in the chat. So the first question was about geography and where the data came from for this particular report. This was a US focused report. We do also have capabilities in the UK as well as throughout Europe, Asia, and LATAM. So if there is a market that's of interest to somebody where we're not currently engaging with you, please don't hesitate to reach out to ask. Ujwal, I'm going to let you answer this question. There's 2 main questions that kind of that came up. The first is, and I'm just kind of reading this from the person that put it in here. In our general engagement, we are, for the most part, working on innovation and R&D projects. I see application here for corporate strategy. Is that something that the methodology is used for on a regular basis?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we're doing so much work actually in corporate strategy. I'll give you one simple example. Corporate strategy has traditionally looked at sustainability initiatives as a cost center, right? For regulatory reasons, or the board has decided, hey, we have goals for 2030 and so on and so forth. And what we're doing is taking those sustainability initiatives and finding the consumer version of it, because consumers do hold certain meanings. Just like we're decoding the meaning of integrity in personal care, we can decode the meaning of a carbon tax for the consumer. And I'm telling you, there is a meaning. There is a consumer translated version of it, and it will offer top line growth. There's just so much we can do in that space. Please reach out to us. In the interest of time, I won't go into more detail, but please reach out to us. Happy to discuss that.
Awesome. And then the next question was in and around kind of some of the ingredients that popped up in ethical footprint.
Yes.
Specifically, do we have some sort of ranking, or what are the top ingredients that are trending? I'm not going to ask you to answer that question. What I am going to ask you to do is can you talk a little bit about what constitutes a trend and how we view basically trend identification from an anthropological standpoint?
Yeah, great question. So, oftentimes, especially in the post-Twitter world, we have gotten used to thinking about a trend as something that gets a lot of mentions. And we often see reports from many of our competitors where a trend is ranked and it says, yeah, mentions increased by 45%. The problem is that's not a trend. It just means a word or a topic is being talked about a lot. A trend is something that is placed within a context and growing in relevancy within that context. So here the context is integrity and personal care. What we are really trying to determine is, okay, so the relationship between, let's take an example, like the relationship between coconut oil and integrity in the context of ingredients. Is that relationship increasing semantically? How do we measure that? First, we determine if in the broader context of conversations, people are linguistically linking coconut oil more and more to the notion of integrity and ingredients. So whenever people talk about integrity and ingredients, maybe the conversation carries into certain types of ingredients and coconut oil gets mentioned a lot. So we're examining whether in the context linguistically that relationship is being established. Once we know that the linguistic contextual relationship is being established, then we quantify that and determine, okay, so within the broader context, how many of these ingredients are showing up? What's the frequency? What's the nature of the relationship? What's the volume and all of that? And that allows us to quantify and surface certain ingredients. So that's why you'll see an ingredient like oxybenzone show up here, right? But it's really important to note that the ingredient is never a trend. Don't ever believe anybody who says an ingredient is a trend. It is never a trend. And the reason is that, I mean, you already know this, no consumer wakes up in the morning going, yeah, oxybenzone, I better never buy any product with oxybenzone. No, ingredients are always symbolic of a real underlying trend. Our job is to figure out what the trend is. In this case, the trend is understanding ingredients gives integrity to the personal care product. So the trend is the microculture of understanding ingredients. At the moment, the trend is manifesting in the form of people avoiding oxybenzone, people looking for coconut oil, people looking for hyaluronic acid, blah, blah, blah. But that does not mean that just because you slap hyaluronic acid onto something, that product will succeed. No. The problem you have to solve is the problem of helping consumers better understand ingredients.
It's perfect, Uj. I've answered the rest of the questions in the chat window. So
wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. We're going to give everybody 15 minutes back. Really appreciate everybody joining us on this fine Friday afternoon. Wish everybody a fantastic weekend.